Quando vai começar? Me digam aí. Alô? Bom dia ainda, pessoal. Nós tivemos um pequeno problema. Parece que eu falei toda a palestra e ela estava agregada na outra. Então, nós vamos ter que resolver esse problema para tarde e a gente vai apresentar agora a palestra da doutora Hilary e Clayton sobre o aprender um pouco, né? Na Escócia. Foi professora na Universidade de Michigan State University por 16 anos e ela é CO na Sport Horse Science em Michigan, Estados Unidos, há 11 anos. É palestrante, autora de 307 artigos científicos e consultora na área de biomecânica de coluna, fisioterapia e reabilitação de equinos. Mais uma vez, eu vou dizer para vocês, empenhamos um esforço para fazer a coisa acontecer de forma positiva e da melhor forma, mas a gente teve alguns probleminhas. Espero que todos consigamos ver bem essa palestra e ler tudo o que está nela. E nós vamos ter que, depois a gente vai fazer o intervalo para o almoço e nós vamos ver a disponibilidade delas em fazer as perguntas online à tarde, porque a gente mudou os horários. A princípio, a doutora Hilary é tranquilo, mas o da doutora Sudaison sobre o etograma, eu não sei como é que vai ficar, se ela vai poder, mas enquanto a gente vê essa palestra, eu já vejo. Qualquer coisa, a gente manda as perguntas e ela responde. Obrigada.
Fazer uma contagem agressiva aqui para a gente soltar o vídeo.
3, 2, 1.
Which we usually abbreviate. Hello, I'm Hilary Clayton, and I'm going to be talking today about the ground reaction force, which we usually abbreviate to GRF. Now, this is an important topic because having some knowledge about the GRF is really fundamental for understanding equine locomotion. It pushes against the ground, so it exerts a force against the ground. Now, force is a vector quantity, and this means that it has not only a magnitude or a size, it also acts in a specific direction. And you kind of know that intuitively because if you push against a table, it has a different effect direction. And you kind of know that intuitively because forces in the pushing and the pulling actions. So force is a vector, and we can represent vector quantities by an arrow. So the arrow is proportional in length to the magnitude of the force. So this purple arrow represents the force of the hoof pushing against the ground. The length of this line is proportional to the magnitude of the force. The arrow represents the direction in which the force is acting, so it's acting downwards and forwards. And the tail of the arrow represents the point at which the force is applied. When the hoof exerts a force against the ground reacts by pushing back against the hoof with a force that's equal in magnitude, but it acts in the opposite direction. So here we see the purple arrow representing the force of the hoof pushing into the ground, and the green arrow representing the force of the ground pushing back against the horse's hoof. So these two arrows, the purple one and the green one, are equal in length, but act in the opposite directions. And the green arrow is representing the ground reaction force. So Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion tells us that for every force, there's an equal and opposite force acting in the opposite 'direction'. 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 'direc The GRF vector is three-dimensional, but since we're looking at a two-dimensional screen, we can only see two of those dimensions at any one time. So in the diagram on the left, that's the side view, and we see the ground reaction force represented by the gray arrow. In the diagram on the right, we see the front view, and here again, the ground reaction force vector is represented by a gray arrow. Now, one of the techniques that we use in biomechanical analysis is to split up that force vector into its components. And the components are generally organized in a vertical direction, a longitudinal direction, and a transverse direction relative to the horse's body. So they make sense in terms of analyzing the effect that they're going to have on the horse's body. So we resolve the ground reaction force vector into three mutually perpendicular components in the vertical, longitudinal, and transverse directions. And here I'm showing you in the side view, we can see the vertical and the longitudinal components. And the way these are calculated, the easy way to do it is make the overall force vector the diagonal of a rectangle. Okay, so these would all be right angles. And then the vertical line is the vertical ground reaction force component, and this is the longitudinal ground reaction force component. And then, using the same techniques when we look from the front, if we assume that these two diagrams represent the same moment in the stride, then the vertical force vector will be the same in magnitude in both of these diagrams. But from the front view, we can also calculate the transverse force component. I said at the beginning that the ground reaction forces are responsible for moving the horse's body, and if there are no forces, then the horse doesn't move. Probably one of the equations that everybody remembers is F equals ma. And this formula is telling us that for a certain force, the horse's body will receive a proportional amount of acceleration. So F is the force applied, M is the body mass of the horse, which isn't going to change, and A is the amount of acceleration applied to this body mass as a result of this amount of force. So the force is causing the body to move. The acceleration that's produced is proportional to the amount of force, and the direction in which the horse's body is going to move is determined by the direction in which the force acts. And here we can see in these photographs the effects of the forces in the three directions. So the vertical force, when applied to the horse's body, will tend to move the horse in a vertical direction. The longitudinal force is responsible for acceleration and deceleration of the horse's velocity. And the transverse force is responsible for turning and doing lateral movements. This is a video taken from the motion capture system. And what we're looking at is a stick figure of a horse trotting across the screen. The darker grey rectangle in the floor is a force plate which measures the ground reaction forces. And you can see the ground reaction force vectors as red lines as the forehoof first. There's the left fore on the plate. There's the right fore on the plate. So you can see those force vectors as they change in length and direction through the stance phase. Now we have a marker on top of the horse's withers that's being followed as well. That's the sort of wavy line at the top, tracking the changes in height of the horse's withers. And just note that for both the forelimbs and the hind limbs, the red line representing the force vector starts off pointing a little backwards towards the tail and then rotates through the stance phase and ends up pointing a little forwards towards the horse's head in the later part of stance. Here's the same horse trotting over the force plate, and this time we're looking at him in the front view. So in this view, we can see the planar view of the vertical and the transverse ground reaction force. You can see that it's fairly vertical, maybe going a little bit laterally during the middle part of the stance phase. It's also interesting to watch the movements of particularly the hind hooves, as they come very close to each other as the leg is swinging forward. And then here's the view from the top. So it's as if we're looking through the horse and the horse is totally transparent. So this time when we see the forces as the horse steps on the force plate, we're seeing the two horizontal forces, the longitudinal and the transverse forces. And I think it's a little easier to see in this view how that force vector is leaning a little bit to the outside of the horse's body, so somewhat of a lateral transverse force in the second half of the stance phase. And you also see quite nicely in this view how the hind limbs are deviating a little inwards. The hooves are coming very close to each other during that swing phase. Using the data from the force plate, we can graph out the ground reaction forces during the stance phase. So what I'm showing here is a graph, this one here, that represents one complete stance phase. So the horizontal axis starts at time 0 and ends at time 100, and that's dividing up the stance phase as a percentage. Okay, so along this axis, we've got percent of the stance phase. And then on the vertical axis, we're looking at the force measured in newtons per kilogram. So the actual value of the force has been divided by the body weight of the horse. And that tends to make horses of different size more equal. So if we look first at the vertical component of the force, which is shown here in blue, you can see it has a little wobble during the contact phase, and then it increases smoothly to a maximum in the middle of the stance phase, and then decreases again. And the vertical force has by far the largest magnitude, and its value is always positive. It's always above the 0 line. Now, if we look next at the longitudinal force, which is in pink, you can see that it wobbles around a little bit during the impact phase, and then it's below the 0 line for a while. So it has a negative value, and then it comes above the 0 line and has a positive value. When the value is negative, the longitudinal force is having a braking or decelerating effect on the horse's velocity. And when the longitudinal force is positive, then it's having a propulsive or accelerating effect. Now the third force component is the transverse force, and it's shown by the yellow line here. And you can see that when the horse is moving on the straight, the transverse force differs very little from 0. So for the next part of the talk, we're just going to focus on the vertical and longitudinal forces. So we're going to look at the horse, if you like, in the side view. And then later on, I'll talk about the transverse force in relation to turning. Now, these diagrams at the top, these are stick figures of the forelimb. So this would be the scapular segment, the humerus, the antebrachium, the cannon, and the pastern segments. And I'm showing these at intervals of 20% of the stride. So this is at 20% of stance. This is 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100% of the stance phase. And the white arrows are representing the ground reaction force vectors that correspond at the same time as the stick figures. And you can see that the length of these vectors increases to about the middle of the stance phase and then decreases. And that corresponds mostly with the value of the vertical ground reaction force. But the direction in which the arrow points depends on the longitudinal force. When the longitudinal force is negative, then this arrow is pointing backwards, a little bit towards the horse's tail. And when the longitudinal force is propulsive, then the arrow is pointing a little forward toward the horse's head. Now, the graph that's shown here is the same information as we looked at on the last slide, except that for the pink, the longitudinal force, I've changed the scale. I've put it on a bigger scale, and I've moved the 0 line up for the pink force so that you can see a little bit more clearly how the vertical and the longitudinal forces vary in relation to each other. And one of the things that you'll notice in this forelimb tracing, and that's important to know, this is from a forelimb, is that the peak vertical force is occurring a little later than the transition from braking to propulsion in the forelimb. Now, just as a reminder, here's another little animation, stick figure of a horse trotting over, this time a series of 4 horse plates. So instead of just seeing the force vector for one limb at a time, we can see the forelimb and hind limb when they hit different force plates. And the trace here is following the movements of the horse's center of mass. And you'll see it go up as the horse pushes off into the suspension phase, and then coming down to its lowest point in the middle of diagonal stance. So you can see the force vectors for both the forelimbs and the hind limbs initially pointing back towards the tail and then pointing forward, but not totally in synchrony as far as the direction of the vectors. The vertical component of the ground reaction force is always opposing the effects of gravity, and it represents the weight of the horse plus the effects of inertia and muscular contractions, which may be causing the hoof to push harder against the ground. When the horse wants to project his body into the air, then he needs to exert a higher vertical ground reaction force during the takeoff. And in fact, and I'll show you this later, the vertical force increases in both the forelimbs and the hind limbs at takeoff, because by the time the hind limbs actually make contact with the ground, the horse's forehand is already raised, and that's a consequence of the forelimbs pushing harder against the ground in a vertical direction. And then, of course, the hind limbs complete the takeoff by, first of all, flexing and then very powerfully extending, push the horse upward and forward over the fence. Now, factors that affect the vertical ground reaction force. One is the body weight of the horse. Obviously, this humongous draft horse is going to have higher body weight and therefore higher vertical ground reaction forces, even just standing still, than this tiny little miniature here. The forces are going to be different in the forelimbs versus the hind limbs because of the horse's head and neck cantilevered out in front of the horse's body. This relatively increases the amount of weight carried by the forelimbs relative to the hind limbs, and that applies both at stance and during locomotion. So in the standing horse, the forelimbs are carrying about 58% of the body weight and the hind limbs about 42%. And if during the stance phase we total all of the vertical forces in the forelimbs and the hind limbs, the ratios come out just about the same. And gait and speed are other things that will affect the magnitude of the forces. I'm showing this here with a fairly simple diagram of force against time. So we're looking at a time of 3 seconds, and we're showing the vertical ground reaction force for different gaits. So for the walk, trot, canter, and the gallop. And at the walk, you can see that here that for this particular limb, there were 3 stance phases over the period of 3 seconds. And the shape is a little different than we've been looking at in the trot. The shape in the walk is a little bit like the letter M. It tends to have 2 sort of peaks to it. In this one, the first peak is not very well exaggerated, but the second peak is quite obvious. But the thing to note is that the magnitude of the peak force at the walk is very small. Now, when we go to the trot, we introduce a suspension phase, and the suspension phase increases the peak magnitude. So when we look at the trot, we now for this limb have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stance phases during 3 seconds. And the stance duration is much shorter in the trot than in the walk. And the peak magnitude of the force is considerably higher. And this trend increases when we go to the canter and the gallop. There are more stance phases over the 3-second period. The stance duration is getting shorter, and the peak value of the force is getting higher. So if you compare, for example, the walk with the gallop, there are about twice as many loading phases in the gallop. The magnitude of the peak force is several times greater, and the rate at which the forces are being applied is a lot greater also in the gallop. Here I'm showing you the values for the hind limb on the left and the forelimb on the right for a trotting horse, and this would be for the forelimb and the hind limb during the same diagonal stance phase. And the thing to note is that forelimb force, peak force, is higher than the hind limb peak force. Right? So as we've seen in the standing horse, where we've got about 58% of the vertical force on the forelimbs, 42% on the hind limbs, that carries through into locomotion. The longitudinal ground reaction force is acting along the long axis of the horse's body. And during steady state or constant speed locomotion, the total braking and propulsive forces, which would be the braking and propulsive impulses, are about equal. But during acceleration, we get an increase in the propulsive component, and during braking, we get an increase in the braking component. And we can analyze here the longitudinal ground reaction force to indicate whether it's actually providing a braking force or whether it's providing a propulsive force at any moment. And as I said earlier, that's also shown in the direction of the ground reaction force vector. If it's pointing backwards, then it's a braking force. And if it's pointing forwards, then it's a propulsive force. And these braking and propulsive components are generally different in the forelimb and the hind limb. So this is the same graph that we looked at before when we were comparing the vertical force traces in the hind limb and in the forelimb. So now let's compare the longitudinal force traces in the hind limb versus the forelimb. And the thing here is that the hind limb generally has a fairly small braking component and a relatively large propulsive component, and the transition between them occurs fairly early in the stride, usually around 35 to 40% of the stance duration. On the other hand, the forelimb has a larger braking phase and a relatively small propulsive phase, and the transition from braking to propulsion generally occurs after 50% of the stride, here around 55%. So both of those things, both the magnitude of the force and the duration for which that force component, braking or propulsive, is acting, both of those affect the impulse, which is the total amount of force in that particular direction that's generated during the stance phase. So we could say that the hind limb has a smaller braking impulse than the forelimb, but the hind limb has a larger propulsive impulse than the forelimb. So when the horse wants to generate a braking force, the easiest way to do that is for him to strut the legs out in front of himself and kind of do a sliding stop. And that's more or less what this horse on the left is doing as he stops at this fence. So the forelimbs especially are extended forward, uses struts, decelerates the horse rapidly. Or on the right, we've got a roping horse. So the cowboy has just roped the calf. He has to jump off. The horse's job is to stop and then maintain tension on the rope while the cowboy ties the calf's feet together. So the horse is, first of all, stopping very rapidly, decelerating rapidly, and then he's going to maintain that backward-leaning position as he keeps applying tension onto the rope. Now, when the horse wants to maximize the propulsive forces, the forward propulsion, then he has to use the limbs mostly behind the vertical and taking advantage of the full range of limb extension as far as is possible. So when we see the horses coming out of the starting stall, you can see that they're leaning forward as they wait for the gate to open, and here you can see that these horses are leaning quite far forwards, and then they go off in a kind of a bunny hopping gait. It's called half bound. So the forelimbs quite quickly go into a left or right lead, but the hind limbs keep jumping together for several strides. And you can see that here in the rear view, and here's another one and another one, that the hind limbs are acting together rather than having one, rather than picking up a lead. And you can also see that those hind limbs are extended way out behind the horse's body. Propulsion, muscles are able to provide propulsion as they extend the joints. So the more the joints can be extended, the more propulsive effect the horse is able to get. And we can see that same effect here in this horse going up a very steep, rocky hill, that he's trying his best to lean forward and using both the forelimbs and the hind limbs to contribute to propulsion. And a very similar effect in the draft horse pull. The horses are leaning forward, both the forelimbs and the hind limbs are acting predominantly behind the vertical position to provide as much propulsion as possible. So looking at the picture on the left here, racehorse providing maximum propulsion, the hind legs way out behind the horse, fully extended. As the horse becomes more collected, on the other hand, they're not concerned about generating maximum propulsion. They're concerned about maintaining a very bouncy sort of a stride. And as we come back through collected trot to the passage, we have a slower and slower forward movement. And in that case, the horses rotate the legs through a very small range of protraction and retraction. And the picture on the right shows a horse in the passage. And if you look at the two hind limbs here, this is just about the full range of protraction and retraction in the passage. And the range of motion would be about the same in the forelimbs. The right forelimb here is pretty much fully retracted, and the forelimb is going to maybe protract just a little bit more before it comes down to the ground. So a very small range of protraction and retraction in the highly collected gaits like the passage. The next thing we're going to look at is the different gaits. So we'll look at the walk, the trot, and the canter. And in the walk, I think everybody's pretty much aware that it's a slow speed gait. The footfall sequence would be left hind, left front, right hind, right front. And they alternate between having 3 legs on the ground and 2 legs on the ground. And one of the important characteristics of the walk is that it has no suspension phase. So there are always either 2 or 3 grounded feet. So the way that the horse adjusts speed in the walk is to change the amount of limb protraction and retraction. And we're going to look at a little animation here of a walking horse. I wanted to point out a couple of things before we actually run the animation. So we've seen the path of the center of mass in several of these animations before, but at the trot. And at the trot, it's going up and down with the rhythm of the suspension and the diagonal stance phases. Whereas in the walk, because there's no suspension phase, the path of the center of mass is almost horizontal. Some little rise and fall of the center of mass, but not much. Whereas if you watch the height of the withers and the croup, you'll see the withers go up and then the croup goes up. So the horse is going up and down in front and behind, but those movements are out of phase with each other. So the middle part of the horse is staying at almost the same height. The other thing you can see is that with this 4-beat rhythm of the walk, the footfalls are all out of sequence, and the ground reaction forces are, well, they look kind of all over the place when you just look at the vectors, but it's the same principle as at the trot. For each of these vectors, you'll see that, first of all, it's providing a braking force, and then it's providing a propulsive force. What makes it look complicated is the way that the 2 forelimbs and the 2 hind limbs are overlapping in their stance phases. So here I've drawn what looks like a very complicated graph, but it's really not that complicated. It's showing the ground reaction forces at the walk over a couple of well, it's actually 4 stance phases, but it's only 1.5 or 2 complete strides. So let's just break it down here. It's not as hard as it looks. You can tell which are the forelimbs and which are the hind limbs by the peak value of the vertical force, which is shown on the vertical axis. So the forelimbs always have higher peak forces. It's one forelimb, the other forelimb, right forelimb, and the left forelimb, and again the right forelimb. Okay? So the forelimbs have, first of all, their lower peak and then a higher peak. The same on the other forelimb, a lower peak and then a higher peak. The hind limbs have altogether lower values for the peaks, but they usually have a higher first peak and a lower second peak. A higher first peak and a lower second peak. And the higher peak occurs when the limb is more closely underneath the horse's center of mass. So the front limb starts out in front of the horse, and the horse moves forward over the limb, so the center of mass comes closer to the grounded forelimb. So the second peak is higher in the walk, in the forelimb. Whereas the hind limb steps forward underneath the horse's body and is fairly close to the center of mass in the early part of the stance phase. And then as the horse's body continues moving forward over the grounded hind limb, we have the second peak. But by this time, the body has moved ahead of the grounded hind limb, so this is the lower peak. Now, the yellow line is the one that's really maybe more important here. And the yellow line is the combination of the vertical forces of all of the limbs across this same period of time. So we're just adding all of these forces of all of the grounded limbs, and this is what we get. Okay? And it's the very same regular trace in each half of the stance phase. So from here to here would be half of a walk stride, and from here to here would be the other half of the walk stride. So this is the time of one complete walk stride. Now the horizontal white line that I've drawn in here, that represents the body weight of the horse. So in the walk, the total vertical ground reaction force is oscillating above and below and above and below the horse's body weight. Okay? And if we were to sum all those together over the stride, the value would be approximately equal, the average value, I should say, would be approximately equal to the horse's body weight. So keep that in mind, don't lose it, as we go on and look at the trot. So in the trot, the legs are synchronized and loaded in diagonal pairs, we know that, and diagonal stance phases alternate usually with suspension phases. And horses increase speed at the trot primarily by covering more ground during the suspension phases. Now here we've got the trotting horse again, and we can see the oscillations of the horse's center of mass. You can actually see that little dot moving along the trace, and that's the instantaneous position of the horse's center of mass as he goes by. You can also see the values of the ground reaction forces, the force vectors, and that these vectors are longer at the trot than they were at the walk. So on this graph, I'm showing the vertical ground reaction force for one diagonal stance phase at the trot, and I'm showing the value for the hind limb, which is here in blue, the forelimb, which is here in pink, and then the yellow is the summation of the values for the fore and hind limb. So this is the total or net vertical ground reaction force during the stance phase. And because the fore and hind limb are synchronously loaded, the value of the total force is much larger than it was at the walk. So again, the white line is approximately equal to the body weight of the horse. And you can see that the peak force value for the forelimb here is a little higher than the horse's body weight, and the peak value in the hind limb is a little lower. But the peak value for the net force is considerably higher than the horse's body weight. One of the things I've been interested to look at is how the stride changes as the horse becomes more collected. So in this slide, I'm showing you, first of all, for the hind limbs on the left, this graph shows the values of the vertical force and the longitudinal force for the working trot in pink and the collected trot in green. And the differences you can see are that pretty much throughout the stance phase, the vertical force is higher in the hind limbs than in the collected trot than it is in the working trot. And you can also see quite a marked difference in the longitudinal force, that in the collected trot, the hind limb is exerting hardly any braking force, and the hind limb longitudinal force is almost entirely propulsive. Now, when we look at the forelimb force, we see that the vertical force is higher in the early part of stance, and the peak vertical force is higher in the forelimb. And then in the later part of stance, there's really no difference between the collected and the working trot, but certainly a significantly higher peak value in both the forelimbs and the hind limbs in the collected trot. What about the longitudinal force? Well, in the forelimb, in the collected trot, it becomes more braking and a little less propulsive. So this is really showing us that indeed the hind limbs are the horse's engine. And as the horse becomes more collected, the hind limbs provide more and more of the propulsive force or impulse. Whereas the forelimbs are responsible for controlling speed and for controlling direction. Now, on this slide, these are two graphs that you've seen before, the walk on the left and the trot on the right, and just showing the ground reaction forces for all the limbs, and then in yellow, the total combined force. And the horizontal white line is equal to the body weight of the horse. So in the walk, where we've got this rather flat trajectory for the path of the center of mass, we have very small oscillations in the force above and below the horse's body weight. Whereas in the trot, we have the center of mass bouncing up and down, and we can see very large oscillations in the total vertical ground reaction force, increasing to a high value here, almost twice the horse's body weight, and then decreasing down to 0 during the suspension phases. Now, it's important to be aware of these differences, especially if you're doing some rehab with horses. We start the rehab at the walk usually, and especially with soft tissue injuries, the time when you start to increase trotting is really critical. And the reason it's so critical is because of the higher magnitude of the ground reaction forces in the trot. And the magnitude of these forces is going to be higher as the horse performs a more impulsive type of a trot. So when you start trotting in a horse that's had an injury, particularly a tendon or ligament injury, you want to start with the smallest trot possible, like a little tiny jog trot, and use that jog trot for a period of 2 to 4 weeks before allowing the trot to gradually become a little bigger. And it's important to realize that there is a huge difference between how you should ride the horse when he's being rehabilitated from an injury versus how you ride him when you're trying to train him to be a better performer. And I think that's something that people don't always realize. Now, moving on to the canter. So in the canter, this is now an asymmetrical gait, and it has a sequence of limb contacts that go from the hind to the forequarters. So we start with the trailing hind. The horse moves forward over the diagonal pair and finishes up with the leading forelimb. So we have a sequence of supports that goes from the hind to the front and also from one side to the other. So when the horse is on a right lead, it goes from the left side to the right side. If he's on a left lead, it goes from the right side to the left side of the horse's body. In the canter, speed is increased by covering more ground in the suspension phase. And with one suspension per stride, we see an undulating path of the center of mass trajectory, but with only one up and down per stride, whereas if we had 2 up and downs coinciding with the 2 suspension phases. So again, here's the animation of the horse cantering. This is the path of the center of mass. And you can see the various overlapping ground reaction forces for the trailing hind, the diagonal pair, and then the leading front. This is the same graph that we've been looking at for the walk and the trot, showing the ground reaction forces in the canter during one complete stride. Now, the color coding is that we start on the left, and the blue is the trailing hind. But the blue is hidden underneath the yellow here. So the trailing hind contacts the ground. It's the only leg on the ground initially, so the yellow trace is following the blue trace, reaches a peak around the time that the diagonal legs contact the ground, and then the force decreases in the trailing hind. Here we've got the diagonal pair. The hind limb of the pair is in blue, and the front limb of the pair is in pink. So blue is the leading hind, pink is the trailing front. And you can see that their force, vertical force, increases synchronously and decreases synchronously. But it's the forelimb of the pair that has the higher vertical force. And in both the forelimb and the hind limb, the peak vertical force is somewhere around being equal to the body weight of the horse. And then here in the mauve, we've got the ground reaction force of the leading forelimb, and it's increasing to a maximum value around the time that the diagonal pair is lifting off. And then at the end of the stride, it's the only limb on the ground. So when we look at the value for the combined vertical forces, the total vertical force. We can see that in the beginning, it's equal to the force on the trailing hind limb. And then as soon as the diagonal pair contact the ground, total force increases rapidly to a peak value in the middle of diagonal stance. And then it decreases until when the diagonal pair lift off, it's equal to the force in the leading front leg. Now, one thing to notice is that sometimes people think that when there's only one leg on the ground in the canter, that leg is very heavily loaded, and that's actually not the case. The load is relatively lower in the trailing hind and the leading front leg, which are the two legs that are, at least for a time, on the ground as the only leg on the ground. So it's a unilateral stance phase. I mean, a unipedal stance phase, I should say. And the peak force in the canter is in the middle of the stride when the diagonal limb pair are in the middle part of the stance phase. We're going to move on now and look at the transverse ground reaction forces. And we already saw that these are quite small when the horse is moving along a straight line, but they're much higher during turning and lateral movements. So transverse forces need to be generated in order for the horse to turn or to move sideways. And the way that the horse does that is to push sideways against the ground. So usually to angle the legs against the ground during the push-off. The reason they do that is because turning requires the generation of a turning force that's also called the centripetal force, and in actual fact that turning force is provided by the ground reaction force acting in a transverse direction. If you have horses circle on the lunge on a very small circle, in this case a 6-meter diameter circle, then they naturally lean towards the inside of the circle. And on that 6-meter diameter circle, they would lean inwards by an average of 15 degrees, and that's what 15 degrees looks like compared with the vertical. So the horses lean inwards, and the advantage that that gives them is that then when the hoof pushes against the ground, it pushes downwards and outwards. So the ground reaction force is pushing the horse's body upwards to oppose gravity, but also inwards, towards the inside of the circle or the turn. And you can see that the ground reaction force vector under these circumstances is going to be pretty much aligned with the long axis of the horse's limb. So this arrow is going through the joints of the limb. And that means that the torquing or the turning effects on the outside and the inside of the joints is actually minimal. Now, the amount of centripetal force or transverse force that's needed increases as the horse moves faster around the turn, and it also increases as the radius of the turn decreases. So this is actually the formula for calculating that. And it's the mass of the horse, m is the mass, multiplied by the velocity squared, and then divided by the radius of the turn. So because the term for velocity is squared, a small increase in the speed of the horse going around the circle has a rather large effect on the size of the transverse force that's needed. Whereas the radius of the circle, as the radius decreases, there is a proportional decrease in the, a proportional increase in the magnitude of the turning force that's needed. This is rather a nice stick figure of a horse going around a 6-meter diameter circle and stepping on a force plate. Now, this line that you see here, this is the line prescribed by a marker. Maybe you see it here, the little dot on the middle of the horse's back, so actually just behind the withers. So that's the path being followed by the middle of the horse's back, and you can see that all 4 of the hoof prints are outside of that line. So that's how much the horse is leaning inwards here. And when you look at the ground reaction force vector shown as that red line, you can see that it is indeed pointing inwards towards the center of the circle. So there are actually 2 ways of generating the turning force. And the way that the horse would choose to do it is to lean inwards, and then he pushes outwards, down and out, and the ground reaction force, looking in the frontal view, is directed upward and inward. And it's more or less aligned along the long axis of the limb. So as I said before, the medial-lateral joint torques are going to be minimal. That's the way the horse would choose to turn. But then, very often we train the horse, we train our sport horses to turn with their legs and bodies vertical to the ground. So then, when we ask them to generate an inwardly directed turning force, the horse has to do that by increasing the friction between the hoof and the ground, or rather relying on friction between the hoof and the ground. So when this hoof is on the ground, the horse is going to use the abductor or adductor muscles to effectively pull the leg towards the center or towards the outside of the circle. But because of the friction between the hoof and the ground, the hoof is not actually going to move relative to the ground. It's just going to generate a force that acts either, in the case of this leg on the inside of the circle, it's acting laterally relative to the limb, and for the other leg, the leg on the outside of the circle, it will be acting medially relative to the limb. And that then gives us a force vector that is not aligned with the long axis of the horse's limb. So we're going to have a torque or a turning force generated on the medial side of the inside leg on the circle and on the lateral side of the outside leg on the circle. So kind of pick your poison. You have the horse leaning into the circle and having the force vector better aligned with the limb, or you teach the horse to move in a better balance and bending the back at the same time, but then we have a force vector that's not aligned along the long axis of the limb. Now, when the horse is traveling around a circle, the limbs on the inside and the outside of the circle are loaded a little differently. And here I'm showing you the average vertical force on the 2 front limbs in pink and on the 2 hind limbs in blue. And the asterisks above the columns indicate that the 2 values are significantly different. So in the forelimbs, the value on the inside fore is lower than the value on the outside. So the outside forelimb has higher vertical force, or is carrying more weight, we could say, than the inside forelimb. And the same thing is true for the hind limbs. The inside hind has a lower force than the outside hind, and so the outside hind is actually carrying more weight than the inside hind. And that's a little bit the opposite, I think, of what we've often been taught in the equestrian literature, that where we expect the legs on the inside of the circle to be the ones that have a higher vertical force, where in fact it's the legs on the outside of the circle that are doing more of the weight bearing. The previous slide showed that we have higher forces in the limbs on the outside of the circle than in the limbs on the inside of the circle. And the differential between those forces is going to increase as the circle gets smaller or as the horse travels faster around the circle. And eventually we can get to a point where the differences are so great that the horse actually starts to look lame. And he starts to look lame on the legs on the inside of the circle. And if he travels at approximately equal speeds on circles of the same diameter to the left and to the right, then the horse will look lame on the legs on the inside of the circle in both directions. So he can appear to have bilateral lameness when in fact it's just showing the effects of turning around the circle. So we've come to the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it and stay safe.
Boa tarde a todos. Agradecemos a presença, em presença para nós ouvirmos a Hilary e Clayton. E nós vamos voltar às 2 horas da tarde para continuar a nossa programação. Se vocês tiverem alguma dúvida em relação a alguma coisa que foi dita, tanto antes na palestra da Sue Dyson quanto da Hilary e Clayton, vocês podem acessar o Instagram da Liga Acadêmica, que é coldelaria.nig, e mandar as perguntas por direct, que mais tarde vamos respondê-las, tá bom? Então, até a tarde.